Oh, thank God football is back. I mean, I loved college basketball. It was so much fun with the guys at Right Angle. I loved NBA with Drew at ETR. And baseball's been great with Derek Carty, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to NFL, it is just so much better than every other sport. And it is not even close. And everyone watching the show knows it too. It's so much better than everything else. And yes, Ryan Schultz, I miss football talk too, and I'm glad to be with everybody here, most of which are probably on their lunch break. If you're in the Eastern time zone, if you're in the Pacific time zone, you're at the desk, you're in the bathroom, kind of a 45-minute bathroom break to get in some props. I don't know what's going on, but we got people from everywhere, a lot of people joining the show, so I appreciate everybody coming back. Crazy Carl, NFL is king. There is no question about it. It's the season ends, you get the draft now, and the rest just doesn't matter. Like, oh man, some of this extended NBA talk and the injuries, it's too much. When it comes to football, everything just makes sense and sounds right. With that said, I have about 20 props. So I'm not if we do it in like the release show style, this show will take 3.5 hours. So I'm not going to hold everybody here till mid-afternoon. I've got producer Brady with me, as always. And so we're going to kind of bounce around. And for some of the stuff that's easily accessible, we'll pull up the news or something that the bet was made off of. And I'm just going to read out the prices that were generally sort of widely available when I put together all the lists this morning. And then everybody in chat, as we do during the usual release shows, just let us know if you found a better price, and then I'll share that. So we'll go back and forth. And of course, if you guys have questions along the way, just drop it in the chat and I'll be able to get back and forth on it. But I think it makes sense knowing that a lot of folks are eating lunch, or you're just kind of following along. Let's just get going with the props, and I'll read them out. We'll get to some analysis. And I would say the important thing to know is every single one of these props is being given out because it is tied to something. There was, for the most part, news or a quote. Something came out somewhere that this is tied to. These are not props that I am betting where it's like, well, this was way off from another market. Like today with Walker, I know if you had William Hill here in Canada, they had plus 150. Everywhere else was minus 160 and higher. There's been a ton of those where you're just betting because the price is way off. These are not those. And it's tough to do NFL draft props because they're so finicky and they move so much. But just note that these are all tied to something somewhere. So we'll start off with a really good one. And this is one I like, but also one that the people that I respect most when it comes to NFL as well as prop betting like a lot too. And that is total safeties drafted in the first round over 1.5. So minus 250 was kind of that widely available number this morning. If this is something you've bet or it's something you're betting right now you see elsewhere, let me know what price you found, where you found it, and we'll try to help everybody else who's watching the show. Hamilton is a given. I think at this point, there's no question that he is going to go within the first half of the opening round at the latest. And for me, I really believe that Daxton Hill is going to get drafted late in the first round. And so I think that makes it for sure potentially even higher that this could ultimately go. And so I think for the most part, Jonathan Eden said he got this at minus 200. But for safeties over 1.5, I think it's really good. Dave G brought up a good point relative to this bet. And he says, Dax Hill is listed as a cornerback. Assuming all books can classify him as they please, does that change the bet? So there's actually a lot of books that will tell you who is classified as what. Just because they're listed in a specific market doesn't necessarily mean that classification, but almost all books will grade off of the draft card that is presented and announced at the draft. And so whoever's giving up the pick will say the name and the position of the player as he is drafted. That tends to be the official ruling for everything. I know somebody who has actually messaged 5 or 6 of the major regulated books, and all of them have him classified as a safety. So what I have heard is that there is a very high chance that that announcement at the draft, when Hill is drafted, he will be announced as a safety, which should deem the ruling at a lot of these books to being a safety. So not only do I like the safeties over 1.5 in the first round, but Daxton Hill to be drafted in the first round as well is a bet that I would just make sort of correlated to this, is I think he's going to be the second one to go, which would get the over 1.5. And then it would also cash with Hill being drafted within the first round. So that would be the first two bets that I would say to make. Bobby Boucher, I'm sorry if I'm putting the French accent on it, but minus 190, top 32. That would be the same thing as being drafted in the first round. Alex Jackson said, got Dax Hill first round, minus 130 earlier this week. Looks good now. It certainly does. That price that I was seeing this morning before I went on VSiN was minus 160. So those two, safeties over 1.5, Daxton Hill first round, both of those good to go, and definitely starts things off here on the show. Continuing on, two bets on the same guy. Garrett Wilson to be drafted top 10 at minus 210. And then Garrett Wilson to be the first wide receiver selected at plus 105. And producer Brady, I might send you the FanDuel on this one if you have it up, because they have both of these markets. DK will as well. Everywhere's going to have the Wilson ones. They have the more NFL draft prop somewhere at the top there, whether you have all the extra markets. But there's Garrett Wilson to be a top 10 minus 210. And then they have the position ones at that top bar where it's Wilson, more NFL draft. There we go. Wilson, the first wide receiver selected. That's still plus money all over. It's a deep wide receiver class. And everything in the news is suggesting that there is going to be a run on wide receivers in this draft. So there's a lot of them that are going to go in a hurry. Everything that has come out has suggested that Garrett Wilson is separated from the rest of the group. Jameis Williams has got a lot of attention. He's got a lot of press, but Wilson has always been that guy that's the step above. And so I don't think there's any way that Wilson will make it past 8 at Atlanta. And so getting him at plus money, again, he's clearly above the rest of the class. And getting him to go top 10, I think matches up well, because I don't believe he makes it past Atlanta. So Wilson, both of them, both to go top 10 and to be the first wide receiver drafted, 2 picks on Wilson that are really good. One that I know has moved, and so I'll need help from everybody here in the chat, depending where you look. Derek Stingley to be drafted in the top 10. So I didn't see what FanDuel had before we took it off the screen there. But I know that this one has moved a little bit this morning. So there's probably a better release around minus 250 on this one. We have the banner at 200, but that's okay. Again, guys, let us know in the chat where you're looking at these and what you're betting. A lot of ties to Stingley. It is minus 200. Okay, so if you're at FanDuel, it's great. A lot of ties to Stingley to going inside the top 5. There's been a ton of interest for him at 3. Ton of interest in him potentially at 4 as well as 7. And then it's very unlikely he would make it past 10 if he slips that far. I think he's a guy that goes very early based on the news that has come out. And so Stingley top 10 minus 200, that price relatively short. So we're seeing that that's for the most part minus 200 is basically what everybody is seeing. Connor, who just said the Wilson number for first receiver is like minus 150. We just had it at FanDuel. It was plus 105. So that's still plus money at a number of different books, but it's obviously important to shop around with these draft props, of course, but you can still find Wilson first wide receiver at plus money at a number of different sports books. So quick recap here. Ben just said plus 120 as well on DK. Total safeties over 1.5. Daxton Hill first round minus 160. Garrett Wilson top 10 minus 210. Wilson first wide receiver off the board plus 105. Derek Stingley top 10 minus 200. And we'll continue on with Chris Olave under 16.5. There were 2 17.5s available this morning. One was at Caesars. I can't remember the other one off the top. I believe it was MGM, but we don't have to bounce around for that. Olave under 16.5 will be the release, minus 105. That's the number you're going to find everywhere. There's a really high priority that teams are putting on speed within wide receivers. So I think there's, again, going to be a run on these receivers. We're going to see a lot of them go, and there's a lot of teams specifically looking for receivers from that 10 to 16 range. And with there being such a high priority on speed, nobody's quicker in this draft class than Olave. He ran a sub 4.340. Teams love that, and it's been referenced a number of times. And so while all of this kind of gets muddied once you get past Wilson, I think Olave, as we've seen recently too in the last couple of drafts, that high speed guy tends to surprise the market and tends to surprise a lot of people. I think we're going to see a team go on him in the first half of the first round. So I like that at under 16.5. Next one I thought was really interesting. Andrew Booth over 28.5. And so it says minus 115, but I know this has moved this morning as well. We're seeing it more. I talked about this on VSiN. People queued into it, but it was also yesterday afternoon. There was a release from a group that carries a lot of influence with them. They're really good at what they do. They sent out over 28.5. The entire view on this bet specifically is based on the Booth injury and medical history. So his injury list is extremely long, but his recent injury is a double sports hernia, and he's got core issues as well. And so Booth was tied to New England and Buffalo at the back end of the first round. The Patriots, historically, on that very late, there's a week cutoff before the draft. So last Thursday was the last time teams could visit with players. The Patriots, when they're interested in someone historically, they always have them for a visit very late. And they do that every time that there's issues around injuries or health, which is exactly what Booth was dealing with. And the Patriots in general were very openly speaking about Booth as much as they do as an organization. But there was a lot of beat reporters that were sort of tying Booth to it. Same thing with Buffalo. Since last week, all of that has completely disappeared. And so he had to visit again with the Patriots very late, which suggests they were doing the injury checkup. And now we've seen it flip. And so I think there's more than being said about the core injury. I think there's more being said about the sports hernia, how that surgery went. And considering how deep the cornerback class is this year, I think we see Booth slide out of the first round. So FanDuel now has 29.5. We're seeing on the screen here 28.5 at minus 190. This has moved a ton, not only in the last 2 hours, but in about the last 16 hours too, since a couple of groups bet this yesterday. So obviously on the screen here, we have a price that doesn't reflect what we're looking at. When you look at the sportsbook behind, that's a better representation. Again, where this gets difficult is these move a ton. So I'll leave it up to everybody here. There's health and injury concerns with Booth. Teams know it. It's very obvious. If you think that he's going to slide out of the first round, this is a very good bet. At top, he was 27.5. So this has moved about 2 draft spots. So we're seeing this slide. If it's going over, he's out of the first round. He'll be drafted on day 2. That's what you should be thinking about when it comes to Booth and that injury issue that he is dealing with. Off of the Booth bet, Kyler Gordon in the first round to go in the top 32, which we can find here on FanDuel too. I think that is where the switchover happens. And what's interesting about Kyler Gordon specifically is he's a guy, when the 20 players that were attending the draft were announced, his name was on the list, and people were really surprised by it. When you look in all the comments about who was attending the draft, a lot of the comments in reply to the tweet was like, why is Kyler Gordon there? Who invited Kyler Gordon? Why is this happening? It's very rare that you get a guy going to a draft who's like a fringe first rounder, going out of his way to be there, unless there's some indication given to him that there was interest of a team taking him in the first round if it got to that point. So I think there's something going on there, which is why he's attending it. But with Booth sliding out, you still have those teams that were tied to a cornerback, specifically Booth, going to still likely be looking for a cornerback. And there was a specific tweet about Kyler Gordon, which I thought was interesting, from a reasonably well-respected draft account that said that multiple teams have been looking at Gordon and said that they do not believe that he is going to make it out of the first round without being selected. And that got a little bit of attention too. So this price on Gordon is coming in a bit, in correlation with Booth, in correlation with the news, in correlation with the announcement that he will be in person at the draft as one of the 20 people attending. I think there's a lot of signs here that Gordon may be going in the first round at minus 115. It's a bet I would rather have on side than not. We'll now get into sort of some scattered team to position markets. And we'll start off with the Steelers, and I might send producer Brady down a bit of an advanced search rabbit hole on some of these. So Steelers to draft a quarterback with their first pick, plus 125. It's no secret that the Steelers have been tied to a quarterback basically the entire offseason. They've had, obviously, the tragedy with Haskins. They had Duck Hodges retire. They signed Trubisky. They need a quarterback. It's not a secret. Getting them at plus 125 is interesting, but when you dive a little bit deeper, if we like it, I don't know if we can advance search on Twitter, but there was a really fun sort of tweet about Tomlin. If we do like an advanced search, Tomlin wings Willis. I can't remember who sent it out, but it was last week, and it broke down everything that Mike Tomlin has done in the offseason with Willis specifically. And the list was really funny. And it was speaking about how he went to Liberty, how he was at the pro day, how he invited Willis over to Pittsburgh and he was eating with him. Here's the tweet from Andrew Filipponi. So, like, this is just with one quarterback and sort of showing the effort from the head coach, who obviously has a lot of influence within the organization and who they ultimately select. There's just a lot going on here. And you consider the personnel changes with the QB coach, the signing of wide receivers for blocking. That QB coach also comes from a history of coaching running backs and mobile QBs. There's trips back and forth between Tomlin and Willis. Like, he is openly and actively recruiting pretty hard here on this one. So you take the fact that the Steelers have a ton of interest in taking a quarterback in general, just based on team needs, where they're sitting at from a roster construction perspective, where they're sitting at within the draft. And then you start to add on some subjective level stuff like this. For me and a lot of other folks, like, this is really the extent of betting a draft. So when we're looking at the Steelers to take a QB with their first pick at plus money, I think you gotta go and take this one. So Steelers QB is their first pick at plus 125, DK plus 110 elsewhere. What are you guys seeing? Have you already bet this one? What price were you taking? Lots to look at there. We'll go on another advanced search Twitter chase here with Cowboys first pick offensive lineman. And if you search, this will come up. It's from Michael Galkin. I remember this one. So if we go, let's do Jerry Jones offensive lineman, and then any of these words, Parsons. And if we go down to, there we go. And there was Lamb as well, but it was a Galkin quote. So here it is. So this is really what got things stirred up. Will the Cowboys select an offensive lineman early in next month's draft? And this is from Michael Galkin. I hope I'm saying his name right, who's a Cowboys reporter for the Dallas Morning News. Jerry Jones says, we will get one unless Lamb or Parsons is there. And so the extent of this quote and sort of what this means was, if we remember how the Cowboys have drafted recently in the first round, they've had guys fall and slide to them, specifically Lamb and Parsons, who were at their specific position group labeled as like these elite skilled talents that just sort of was an override of everything the Cowboys had from their plan on who they were going to draft. And here's Jerry Jones openly saying he's been public all offseason about who he wants to take in the draft. They want an offensive lineman. But when we go to the draft order on NFL.com and you go down and you see the Cowboys down on the list at 24, and you think about the position groups within this draft and who might ultimately slide, Like, you're not going to get a wide receiver that really stands out sliding to 24. You're not going to get a elite defensive lineman. Those guys are all going to go very early. The quarterback class is probably going to slide in general. The Cowboys are not going to draft a quarterback with Dak Prescott just getting paid, obviously. And they're surely not going to go with a running back, which is going to slide. They're not going to go with a wide receiver either, as I mentioned. They're not going to go with a linebacker. And so it only really makes sense that it's O-line. And when you try to find that guy where Jones is saying, like, if we get that guy sliding, it just doesn't really show up for them at 24. And so when we're looking at Cowboys to take an offensive lineman with their first pick, to me, there's just too much subjectivity out there in terms of the quotes and what Jerry Jones has said. This one, to me, was a pretty good bet. And if you're looking at it plus 125 right now, I still just think based on what's out there, that's a really good bet to ultimately make. Really, the only risk here is probably like a dramatic trade down. But I think this one's a really solid bet to ultimately make. Continuing on with these positional ones, no secret the Atlanta Falcons desperately need a wide receiver. I don't have an advanced Twitter search for this one to pull up. This has been just from a number of different places. There's been mention and intrigue of certain cornerbacks going to Atlanta yesterday or Sunday. What day is it? I'm losing track of my days. They had a tweet that came out, and it was like, imagine this combo with AJ Terrell, who's their elite defensive back, and they were promoting it online. What's interesting is when you go through and look at the markets for the Atlanta Falcons, the cornerback market or defensive back market has never moved. It's been stuck at about 6-1 or 7-1 at any sports book. And so despite all of this hype, usually when it comes to draft props, if there's something to anything with any of this news, because we're all playing from the same pool of information, that's going to have an impact on the market. For the Atlanta Falcons, despite all this talk about a defensive back being drafted, it hasn't moved at all. And when you dive into what we're hearing from the coach and the GM, it's always discussing the absence at wide receiver, especially so after the Calvin Ridley news broke 4 or 5 weeks ago. So I think everything about this is lining up for the Falcons at number 8 to draft a wide receiver. I think there's a decent chance that could very well be Garrett Wilson, and in which case this is tied to those two bets, could potentially get all three if that is to happen. But I think the Falcons at 8 are definitely that stopping point for a wide receiver. So plus money, plus 110. In fact, that's really good. So if anyone's following along, curious, have you bet this already? And if you just bet it right now, where were you betting it? And what did you get at your price? Another one where I'm not going to send producer Brady on a mad article chase through Google, but the Vikings to draft a cornerback with their first pick plus 130. There was an article done by a Minnesota reporter who covers the team, and it was an interview with Adolfo Menza, who's the GM, as well as O'Connell, who is the head coach. And they were kind of like lamenting in the situation that Mike Zimmer had left the defensive back roster spot after he departed. And what was interesting was they went out of their way, both of them, GM and the head coach, to reference how it's like a glaring team need. And the quote from O'Connell was, "We cannot ignore the hole we have at cornerback." And he gave out a list of specifics of the type of guy that he was looking for and he wanted. And it was basically backed up by the GM within the same article. And so it was an interesting piece that really laid out the roster construction of the Vikings, who have been offensive line heavy for the last couple of drafts. They've got that sorted. They've got QB sorted. They're not touching a running back. Their wide receiver group is fine, so that covers their offense. They're definitely going defense with their first pick. And with the skilled defensive linemen and edge rushers all likely to go in front of when the Vikings are drafting, I think it's most likely that the need they are saying, the head coach and the GM, that they cannot ignore is also going to prevent the best player on the board at the time that may not be a wide receiver, which they're not going to be drafting. So defensive back for the Vikings, cornerback, plus 130. Really good bet to make, in my opinion. That price still available too right now. Two more, and this is kind of both of them relating to each other. Both of these bets are at plus money, specifically plus 125 each. They were at FanDuel and a couple other books, and it's probably the squarest bets that I'm making, but it's two that I couldn't necessarily go out of my way to avoid. Both the Packers and the Chiefs to draft a wide receiver with their first picks in the draft. So it's not a parlay or not a combo, but I'm just saying it's the same bet for both teams, and both of them are at plus 125. Both teams have been relatively quiet for what we would expect from both of them, but it's very hard to ignore the fact that both of these teams are desperate. And I know Green Bay is going to give people some headaches because they've had this need for like the last 8 years, it seems, in every draft they fail to do it. I don't think they can look away this year. MVS is gone. Obviously, Devontae Adams is gone. I'd be really, really surprised that the Packers don't go wide receiver. And I would say the same thing for the Chiefs, although they did add two pieces, but I still think they're looking here. Now, the downside to this is that both of the teams, if we go back to the draft order and we look between 22 and 30, where this could potentially be problematic. So the Packers are at 22 and 28, and then the Chiefs are at 29 and 30. And so if both of these teams only had the single pick in the first round, I think we would see these prices much, much higher in terms of the likelihood that it was going to happen. The only spot that this can get messy is if the Chiefs, for example, announce it at 2, or they trade away, and the same thing with the Packers. So anytime you get multiple picks within the single round, especially when it's this close to each other, you can get teams kind of maneuvering. And that's really the risk against this, is that we see them trading back or doing something that switches this ordering, or in the case of the Chiefs, they just offer it somewhere else. So I would say Kansas City, there is definitely some variance within that in terms of how they're going to announce their picks and what comes from that if they stay put. And for Green Bay, I'm a little bit more confident, but just both teams, glaring need that has been referenced. There's plus money on both. I think we get one of two, if not both, and you end up ahead. So those were the two other ones that I've made. So I'll go through a recap here, and then we can get into questions. If you've got anything about the draft, let me know. I'll do my best to answer it. Total safeties, over 1.5 in the first round. Daxton Hill, first round drafted. Garrett Wilson, top 10. Garrett Wilson, first wide receiver off the board. Derek Stingley, top 10. Chris Olave, under 16.5. Andrew Booth, over 28.5, but we'll reference that 29.5 officially. Kyler Gordon to be drafted in the first round. Steelers to draft a QB with their first pick. Cowboys to draft an offensive lineman with their first pick. Falcons to draft a wide receiver with their first pick. Vikings to draft a cornerback with their first pick. And then Packers and Chiefs each to draft a wide receiver with their first pick. All of those position to team markets are at plus money. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 draft props in total in 30 minutes. Not a bad pick to time ratio. The question from Alex Jackson. Adam, how do you feel about Thibodeau under 4.5 minus 140? There was I guess the 5.5s are gone. I don't know. I haven't been looking at it. I've been looking at the 1-2 market for the most part this morning, bouncing between shows. A lot of rumors swirling about the Lions still being interested. A lot of rumors about the Jets being interested at 4. So you've got a couple outs there. I think it's safe to say at this point he's not going 1. Could even potentially see him going 3. So I know somebody specifically who has a large position on under 5.5. That brings the Giants into play. If he makes it to 5 within that mix, I think that would be kind of surprising. I know the Jets in the last few days have really been interested in him at 4. There have been some reporters that have referenced how they would be really surprised. These are Jets reporters if it gets past 4, if he's available. And so just all that combined, I would lean towards saying that the under 4.5 at that price is probably a good bet to have on side. It's not something that I have made. I'm kind of kicking myself for not getting the 5.5. But I think that is looking pretty good as a bet. And then I know ETR this morning, they released an exact combo. So it was Walker 1, Hutchinson 2, Thibodeau 3. And they found that at like 40-1. And I know that shifted a lot of what's going on with the market this morning. There was a lot of references to the Peter King mock draft. It was definitely those bets that those guys were making. And they did that like yesterday evening. And so that's really what's kind of some sort of stirred everything up, so to speak. So think about that one if you're looking at that. Kyle Estrada corrected me. It was Stingley 3. So pardon me. So it's the Stingley top 10. But yeah, so Thibodeau's sitting kind of at the 4, which is your mark on that one. Dave G, who do you think Jets would take, Dib or Sauce? Schrager made a quick comment on McAfee about his friend Rob taking Sauce and has been walking it back since. I think it seems to be shifting. And again, the hard part about the Jets picks, for me anyway, is when you look at all the quotes from Robert Salah or anyone else within the organization, they kind of speak of both picks as one and the same. And it's very hard to find something that's referencing like the Jets are doing this at 4 or the Jets are doing this at 10. Like it's just kind of been like the Jets really want to take an elite defensive player, but they also really need a wide receiver. And then, of course, you have the Debo trade that's kind of swirling around too. So what's ultimately going to happen there? So to me, the Jets have been really difficult. The latest that I was seeing was the Thibodeau at 4, but if Thibodeau, I don't know enough to say it. And that's why when I'm looking at my board, like I have nothing relating to guys going first, second, third, or fourth, because I really don't know. And then you get to 5th. Again, you have the Giants with 2 picks in the matter of 3 picks total. So it gets really messy because a lot of things are just referencing what they're doing as a whole, and I just have trouble with that. So I haven't been betting it, and that's why I'm kind of deferring to some top 10 stuff, because like Stingley could go as low as 3. He could be taken higher up at 7. And so there's just a range with a lot of these guys at the top once you get past 1, 2. Jules says Gardner's going 3. People are not necessarily betting that at the moment, but we'll see what ultimately comes from that. And then Kip Tronettle, pardon me for the last name. I've looked at DK, FanDuel, MGM, but see no NFL draft props yet. Kip, these have been up for 6 weeks. So we are looking at them on the screen. I don't know what version of the site you were on, but they are definitely up there. And they are more than available to bet for everybody who's looking to get a wager down. If anyone else has any last-minute questions, would love to get to them. Otherwise, Zachary says Kip may be in Pennsylvania. I may have them not listed then. I don't know. But we can definitely see them. Maybe some geo stuff going on. That'll do it for me at the moment, unless anybody has anything else. Again, a lot of drafts there. If anything else comes up from a prop perspective in the next 3 days here, a lot of these places will be taking them down on Thursday. If anything comes up, we'll do just an impromptu release show as I go. And if I have any more bets, I'll be sure to let everybody know. If you want to listen to a little bit more detail about what's going on, if you go over to Apple Podcasts, The Simple Handicap, which of course is sponsored by Covers as well, my daily podcast during the NFL regular season, I had a 40-minute pod this morning, went through a lot of the same bets that I just did, but I also talked about why the draft market this year is different, who's impacting it, and kind of the whole shakedown of how things have been going the last 4 to 5 weeks that some folks may find interesting. Otherwise, we will have any draft prop release shows here on the YouTube channel as we go. We've got daily prop content from a lot of the other creators and the great guys here at Covers on the content side. And then we have the release show with Derek Carty for those of you who like MLB props every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Wrap up Bobby Jones. When is Circa releasing their board of draft props? I heard today they're going to have over-unders for 50 players, if I'm not mistaken. Those should be up later today, but it is still obviously early in Nevada. All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the draft. If we have anything else, we will get you updated in the next couple of days with a live release show. Appreciate everybody tuning in, and we will talk to you next time.